It's the fifth book of the Bible and the final book of the Torah. After the exodus from Egypt, Israel was at Mount Sinai for 1 year, entering into a covenant with their God. And then they had the disastrous road trip through the wilderness, and the Exodus generation disqualified themselves from entering into the land promised to Abraham. And so Deuteronomy begins with Moses standing in front of this new generation, explaining the Torah. And it's from here.
The Bible contains the mind of God, the state of man, the way of salvation, the doom of sinners, and the happiness of believers. Its doctrines are holy, its precepts are binding, its stories are true, and its decisions are immutable. Read it to be wise, believe it to be safe, and practice it to be holy. It contains light to direct you, food to support you, and comfort to cheer you. It is the traveler's map, the pilgrim's staff, the pilot's compass, the soldier's sword, and the Christian's charter. Here, paradise is restored, heaven opened, and the gates of hell disclosed. Christ is its grand subject, our good the design, and the glory of God its end. It should fill the memory, rule the heart, and guide the feet. Read it slowly, frequently, and prayerfully. It is a mine of wealth, health to the soul, and a river of pleasure. It involves the highest responsibility, will reward the greatest labor, and will condemn all who trifle with its sacred contents. Pray it in, read it through, live it out, and pass it on.
Hi, I'm John Stevenson, and we're going to be looking at the book of Deuteronomy, introducing the book. First of all, we begin with the title. Our English title is actually taken from the Greek title, from the Greek Septuagint. That was the Greek translation of the Old Hebrew Bible, and there it was called Deuteronomion. Two words there, deutuo, just like we have a duo, that's two people singing, and nomos is the word for law. So this is the idea of the second giving of the law, and I suppose that's okay as a title. It's taken from Deuteronomy chapter 17, verse 18, where we read, "It shall come about when he sits on the throne of his kingdom," that is a future king, "he shall write for himself a copy of this law," that's sort of like the second giving of the law, "on a scroll in the presence of the Levitical priest." Our Hebrew title, the Hebrew name for the book, is Elah Hadavarim. And this is the idea, it's actually taken from the opening words of the book. Traditionally, if you're starting to open a scroll, you get the title, you open the scroll a little way and you look at the very first line, and the first line of the book starts off, "These are the words," and so that became the Hebrew title of the book. And that's not a bad title either, because these are going to be the words that are given through Moses from God to the people. Deuteronomy chapter 1, verse 1, "These are the words which Moses spoke to all Israel across the Jordan in the wilderness." And so that becomes the title of the book. Genesis started off with creation, and we had events like the fall into sin and the flood and the Tower of Babel. And from there we had introduced the family of Abraham. There was Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Joseph, as God promised that he was going to do something special with that family. That promise begins to take place in its fulfillment when we get to the book of Exodus, and God leads the Israelites, who have now become captives in Egypt. He leads them out of Egypt. He brings them to Mount Sinai, where there he gives them the law. So the way to think of the book of Exodus, you have 10 plagues in Egypt, and then they get to Mount Sinai, 10 commandments, and then he gives them instructions to build the tabernacle. You can sort of imagine 10 items in the tabernacle. So 10 plagues, 10 commandments, 10 items in the tabernacle. We turn then to Leviticus, and Leviticus tells us what to do with the tabernacle now that we've got it. It's the ceremonial requirements of how to worship the Lord. And so these are the laws of worship in the book of Leviticus. Numbers picks up where the action left off at Exodus, where they had come to Mount Sinai. And in the book of Numbers, now we read of the wilderness wanderings, where for 40 years the Israelites are in the wilderness because of their disobedience, because they hadn't trusted God to go into the land. Now they're forced to wander in the land for 40 years. And that generation dies out. And now as Deuteronomy picks up, it's the next generation, and they're getting ready to go into the land. But now there's the giving of the law to this generation. And because this generation is getting ready to go into the land, they are going to have special land promises. And there will be the giving of the law, but as it applies to people in the land. Now, we usually think of Deuteronomy as being written by Moses. After all, the ancient Jewish traditions describe Moses as the author. Throughout the book, we're going to see Moses says this and Moses says that. And even in the New Testament, we have all sorts of quotations from the book of Deuteronomy in the New Testament, and invariably we'll read, and Moses says this, and Moses says that. And so, by and large, he's the author. And yet there's evidences of a later editor who comes and sort of takes the parts that are written by Moses and perhaps puts it together or at least completes the book. For example, we read of the death of Moses in Deuteronomy chapter 34. And we read that, he dies and God buries him and no man knows his burial place to this day, which sounds like it wasn't just written the day after he dies. In other words, to this day sounds like, some time has passed. And so it has evidence of a later editor who's at least writing the end of this chapter, if not assembling the other parts of the book from those things that Moses has left. Likewise, we read in Deuteronomy 34:10, since that time no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. That sounds like a considerable amount of time has elapsed, not only through the days of Joshua, but maybe even longer than that. And so when does Deuteronomy come into its final form? We simply don't know. Meredith Kline, he was professor of Old Testament both at Westminster Theological Seminary and also at Gordon Conwell Seminary. We owe him a debt of gratitude both with regards to authorship as well as with regards to the structure of the book of Deuteronomy. He makes some observations that are quite helpful. Dr. Kline noticed in looking at various treaties of the ancient world, you could have one treaty between kings who were equal. There was a king of the Hittites, and as pictured here at the museum in Istanbul, making a treaty perhaps with the Pharaoh of Egypt, and those would be a treaty of equals. Or you could have what was called a suzerain treaty. And in a suzerain treaty, you might have a big king, and notice how he's pictured here, quite larger than life, we could say, and he's conversing with a smaller king, a vassal king. And so we would have this big king who maybe has conquered or has brought under his protection, or in some way is entering into a treaty with a smaller neighboring king, and he would be the suzerain, and the vassal king would be the vassal. Now, in this treaty that they would arrange between the big king, the suzerain king, and the vassal king, it would carry a particular format, especially in the second millennia before Christ. That area that goes 1,000 years before Christ, and earlier than that, the second millennia, the treaties of that era would begin with a preamble, and it would begin introducing the parties. There's the big king, and there's the little king, and maybe some other kings that are involved there, but this would start in a brief preamble. And then there would be a historical prologue, where it would give the history of the relationship of these kings and their kingdoms to one another. Maybe they had started off in peace, or there'd been a time of warfare. Whatever it was, that story is told in a historical prologue. Following this, we now go into the stipulations. If you're to do this and I'm to do this, and these are all I guess we could call them the bullet points of the treaty itself, sort of the guts of the treaty. When the stipulations are finished, next we have a requirement regarding the deposit and reading of the covenant, where each king, the big king and the little king, each get their copy of the treaty, and they're required to take them home and place them in their holy place, perhaps in the temple of their major god within their city. And every so often, usually once a year, they are required by the treaty to bring that treaty out and have it read in public before the king and before all the people, so that no one will say, gee, I forgot about that. Finally, there are witnesses given, and the witnesses are usually the gods of the different, countries that are involved. And there are curses and there are blessings that are pronounced. Curses if you break the treaty, and the curses can range from bad to really bad. And there are blessings pronounced if you keep the treaty. Now, what I've just described is a suzerain treaty, but what I've also just described is the book of Deuteronomy. Notice the book of Deuteronomy follows the suzerain treaty, but it's the suzerain treaty not of a later age, it's the suzerain treaty of the second millennia BC, that time when Moses lived. And so Klein points out that Deuteronomy, in its final form, resembles the suzerain treaty of the days of Moses. And I'm not saying that it had to be all finished by Moses, but in other words, it had its final form already at that very early age. So whenever Deuteronomy is composed, it seems to be composed in that early age. Yes, after Moses, but not thousands of years after Moses. And so here's our outline of Deuteronomy, following that suzerain treaty format. First, we begin with a preamble. That's the first 5 verses or so, 4 or 5 verses of Deuteronomy. And then chapters 1, 2, and 3, and 4 gives the application of that. We have the historical prologue. Next, we have the stipulations, and we begin in chapter 5 with the 10 commandments, but then we move to related commandments, and we're going to see how the 10 commandments really form an outline, a table of contents almost, for the rest of the law, that all the rest of the law will be the expansion of those initial 10 commandments. We come to chapter 27 and we have blessings and cursings. And then chapter 31 and following to the end of the book, we have the succession arrangements, the arrangements on how this covenant is to be passed on to the next generation. And part of that is the deposit and the reading of the covenant. This brings us to the point of the book of Deuteronomy. It's that God is going to enter into a covenant with his people. The book of Deuteronomy forms that covenant. It's written in a covenant format, and God is using something that is familiar to people already, that was known in the ancient world, as he enters into a covenant with his people. He's communicating with them in a way they can understand. And God does the same thing with us today. He did it by taking on flesh with us and sending his son, who was the keeper of the covenant, Jesus Christ, who has become our covenant for today.
The book of Deuteronomy, the epic conclusion to the Torah, and spoiler alert, Moses is going to die. Now, in order to understand this book, we need to remember the story so far.
So Israel has escaped from slavery in Egypt. Then they spend 1 year at Mount Sinai.
This is where they made the covenant with God to obey all of these laws.
Then they wander around the desert for 40 years before they make it to the Jordan River, which is right across from the land God promised them. They're ready to go in. This is where the book of Deuteronomy begins.
And what this book is really is a speech. Moses gives these final words. It's like a pep talk to the new generation of Israel that's about to go into the land. And the speech, it's broken up into 3 large sections.
So Moses begins the first part of the speech with a somber tone because he's highlighting Israel's rebellion and resistance, which has been going on for the last 40 years.
And that sets up the rest of this opening section, which is Moses' challenge to this new generation to be different from their parents and to respond to God's grace with love and obedience. So he reminds them of the 10 commandments, like the basics of the covenant, and then he gives them this very famous line.
Listen, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone. Love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your strength.
Now, in Jewish tradition, this is called the Shema, because the first Hebrew word in this line is Shema Yisrael. And this became a very important prayer in Judaism, said twice a day. And it emphasizes the Israelites' exclusive commitment to their God, the one true God who loved them and who rescued them from slavery.
Right, because they're about to go into a land where people are worshiping many other gods.
And Moses thinks that loyalty to the Lord, their God, is the only way to life. Now, notice these key words in the Shema: listen and love. You're going to find these words all over this opening section of the speech. The word listen in Hebrew means more than just let sound waves come into your ears. It includes the idea of responding to what you hear. So for Israel, this means responding to God's grace by obeying the laws of the covenant.
And then listen is always followed by love.
Yeah, so love is the true motivation for obeying the laws. Israel won't obey without love, and they don't truly love if they don't obey. So there's this tight connection between loving and listening that runs through the entire book. And so Moses tells them that if they do listen and love, they will fulfill their original calling as the family of Abraham, to show all of the nations the wisdom and justice of God, and so become a blessing to them.
The second big section in Deuteronomy is a large block of laws and commands.
And this is where the book gets its name. Deuteronomy means a second law. And it's because many of these laws we've heard before. In fact, in the first line of the book, we're told that Moses is here explaining or clarifying the laws. So he's repeating and expanding on the laws, making them relevant to this new generation.
There's laws about how Israel's to worship God, laws about their leadership structure, laws about social justice, and then some more laws about their worship.
Now, after all of the laws, Moses warns Israel of the consequences of their obedience or disobedience, or in his words, the blessing or the curse. If they listen and love, they will experience blessing and abundance in the land. And if they don't, there's going to be famine and plagues, and they'll be forced off their land into exile.
And that brings us to the final section of his speech.
Yeah, here Moses says, I set before you today life or death, blessing or curse. So choose life. But then things get really interesting, because after 40 years with these people, Moses knows they're not going to obey. And so he predicts their failure and even their future exile from the promised land. And he focuses on what he thinks is the true source of the problem, that they have hard and selfish hearts. It's as if Israel is incapable of truly loving God in a way that brings about obedience.
But this problem isn't unique to Israel.
Yeah, in fact, Moses, when he's using this language about blessing and curse, he's tying Israel's story all the way back to all humanity's story from Genesis 1 through 3.
So Adam and Eve, they were blessed by God just like Israel, and given a choice to trust and obey God like Israel.
And then they rebelled and brought a curse on the land, like Moses knows Israel is going to do. And so these stories, they're about Israel's hard heart, but they're actually a window into the universal human condition.
But Moses doesn't give up hope entirely.
That's right. He says that somehow, on the other side of Israel's exile, God promises to transform their heart so that one day they truly can listen and love.
In the final chapters, Joshua is appointed as the new leader of Israel.
And then Moses takes the entire law code,
The one he just predicted Israel would break.
that's right, and he puts it into the Ark of the Covenant. And then Moses hikes up to the top of a mountain so he can see the promised land from afar, and then he dies. And that's how the Torah ends.
Which is a strange place to end the story. I mean, it's right there at the climax. Will they obey the laws and live faithfully in the land or not?
Well, the story does continue right into Joshua, the next book of the Bible, but this is the end of the Torah, and it's been ended here for a reason. The Torah is written for people who are either outside of the land or who are still waiting for the fulfillment of God's promise to bless the whole world. And so now, as each generation reads the Torah, they find themselves called to hope in what Moses hoped for, a new, transformed heart that one day can truly listen and love. Hey guys, with this video, the Torah series is complete. It was 2 years in the making. We're super happy with how they turned out, and that because of you all, they're available to anybody.
Here's why we're doing this. We believe the Bible is one unified story. It leads to Jesus, and it has profound wisdom for the world.
We hope that the videos have been helpful for you in making sense of and reading the Torah, maybe by yourself or with a small group or a class.
We've been thrilled to see how people have been using this in their homes, with their kids, in schools, at churches, all over the world.
You can download full resolution versions of all these videos at jointhebibleproject.com, and all kinds of other resources there too.
All of this is for free because of a growing number of monthly supporters who are sharing this vision and helping us move forward. So thanks a lot.
The book of Deuteronomy is the fifth book of the Bible and the final book of the Torah. After the exodus from Egypt, Israel was at Mount Sinai for 1 year, entering into a covenant with their God. And then they had the disastrous road trip through the wilderness, and the Exodus generation disqualified themselves from entering into the land promised to Abraham. And so Deuteronomy begins with Moses standing in front of this new generation, explaining the Torah. And it's from here that the design and purpose of the book unfolds. Deuteronomy is a series of speeches from Moses where he's calling the next generation of Israel to be faithful to the covenant with their God. At the center of the book is a collection of laws, which are the terms of the covenant between God and Israel. Some of the laws are new, but many are repeated from the laws given earlier at Mount Sinai. And that's actually where this book gets its name, from a Greek word deuteronomion, which means a second law. Now, surrounding these laws are two outer sections of Moses' speech. Each of these are broken up into two parts themselves. Let's just dive in and we'll see how this whole thing works. So Moses, first of all, summarizes the story so far, and he highlights how rebellious the previous generation was, in contrast with God's constant grace and provision in the wilderness. And God did bring his justice on them, yes, but he did not abandon his covenant promises. After this comes a series of very passionate sermons where Moses calls on this new generation to be more faithful than their parents were to the covenant. He reminds them of the 10 Commandments, and then the centerpiece of this section is a famous line called the Shema. Moses says, "Listen, Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord alone, and you shall love the Lord your God with all of your heart, with all of your soul, and with all of your might." This became a very important daily prayer in Judaism, and it brings all of the themes of the book together. So the word listen, or Shema in Hebrew, it means much more than just to hear. Its meaning includes responding to what you hear, or in English we would say obey. And the word love in Hebrew also means much more than just an emotion or feeling. It's about a decision of wholehearted devotion to God that involves your will and your emotions, your mind and your heart. Now, for Israel, their obedience and devotion to God served a much larger purpose. Obedience to the laws is going to make Israel a unique people among the nations. Just like God said at Mount Sinai, they will become a kingdom of priests. And Moses now says, how? Israel has the chance, by following the laws, to show the whole world the wisdom and the justice of God. The other key idea in the Shema is that Israel was called to obey and be devoted to the Lord alone. Or literally, in Hebrew, it says, the Lord is one. Now, in context, the point is that the Lord is the one God Israel is to worship and obey. Israel's about to go into the land of Canaan, where people worship idol gods that represent all different aspects of creation: the sun, the weather, sex, and war. And in Moses' view, worshiping these gods degrades humans and destroys communities. But worshiping the God of Israel, who's the creator and the redeemer, that will lead to life and blessing. And so we come to the large collection of laws at the center of the book. And they're roughly arranged by topic. So the opening section is about Israel's worship of their God. They were to have one central temple where one God would be worshipped. And also, God was to be worshipped in Israel's care for its poor. So, for example, all Israelites were to set aside 1/10 of their annual income to be given to the temple. But another 10th was to be set aside every 3 years and given to the poor. And these are the kinds of laws that put Israel on the cutting edge of justice in comparison to their ancient neighbors. And it was all bound up with their worship of God. The next section outlines the character qualities of Israel's leaders. So the elders, the priests, the kings, these were all placed under the authority of the covenant laws, which God said that he would enforce by sending prophets to keep the leaders accountable. So in contrast to Israel's neighbors, where kings were thought of as divine and a law unto themselves, Israel's leaders were subordinate to the law and the prophets. Following this is a large section of laws about Israel's civil life, so rules about marriage and family and business, and also about social justice, about their legal system and how it was to protect widows and orphans and immigrants. And then these are concluded by more laws about worship. Now, here's some tips for reading all of these laws. Remember, first of all, these are the terms of the Sinai covenant given specifically to ancient Israel, living in a culture that's very different from yours. And so, two, it's not going to be helpful to compare these laws with modern laws from a very different culture. Rather, these were given to set Israel apart. And so we need to compare these laws with those of Israel's neighbors, like in Assyria or Babylon. And when you do that, all of a sudden, laws that seemed harsh or bizarre become much more clear. You see that God is pushing Israel to a higher level of justice than was ever known before. And so finally, try to discern what core principles of wisdom or justice underlie any particular law, and you'll discover some really profound things. So here's an extra credit assignment. Go see how Paul the Apostle does this very thing in his first letter to the Corinthians, chapter 9, verse 9, and he quotes a law from Deuteronomy chapter 25, verse 4. It's really interesting. So back to Moses. After he goes through all of the laws, he issues a final challenge that Israel should listen to and love their God. He first issues a warning and an ultimatum. If Israel listens to and obeys their God, everything's going to go great, lots of divine blessing. But if they don't listen and rebel, famine, plague, devastation, and ultimately exile from the land. And then Moses forces a decision. He says, "Today I set before you all life or death, blessing or curse, goodness or evil. So choose life by loving the Lord your God and listening to him." But then Moses says this. He says, "I know that after I die, you're going to rebel and turn away from God and end up in exile." Which is kind of a downer. But then again, he's been with these people for decades, and it becomes clear that his hopes are not very high. But all is not lost, Moses says. One day, when Israel is sitting in exile, at any point, Moses says they can turn back to their God, who will, in his words, circumcise your hearts so that you may love him with all your heart and soul and live. Now, this is a vivid metaphor that's saying something is fundamentally wrong with Israel's heart. It's stubborn and hard. And it's the same thing wrong with the heart of all of humanity. This is going all the way back to the rebellion in the garden. Humans seized autonomy from God. They wanted to define good and evil for themselves, and they ruined God's good world as a result. But one day, Moses says, God is going to do something to transform the hearts of his people so that they can truly listen to and love God from the heart and be led back to true life. And this is the promise that gets picked up by the later biblical prophets, Jeremiah and Ezekiel, the hope for a new heart. So Moses ends his speech with a poem of warning and then of blessing, and then he walks up onto a mountain and he dies. And so the Torah draws to a close. All of the major plot tensions of the biblical story are in place, but left totally unresolved. So when is the descendant of the woman going to come and defeat evil? Or how is God going to rescue the whole world and bless all nations through this family? And how can God's holiness be reconciled with people who are continually rebellious? And how is God going to transform the hearts of his people? You just have to keep reading to find out. But for now, that's what the book of Deuteronomy is all about.